Our study begins in 1898 when the Philippines declared its independence from Spain. Although the Philippines was free from its European colonizers, the Treaty of Paris introduced a new regime, the United States. The Treaty of Paris enabled the United States to purchase the Philippines from its former colonizers for $2 million. In the following year, the Philippines declared war against this new occupation, thus sparking the brief Philippine-American War. The war came to an end on July 4, 1902, officially marking the beginning of U.S. colonization. With it came many educational reforms which would affect Philippine migration to the United States, up to the present day.
Dorothy Rony argues that under American colonization, education was a key vehicle in the restructuring of Philippine society. Compared to rule under the Spanish government, the American system promoted greater access and emphasized technical and academic curriculum. The U.S. worked through benevolent assimilation, providing a national system of public primary schools, thus making education more accessible than ever before.
In 1903, the U.S. and Philippine government implemented the pensionado program. The objective of the pensionado program was to sponsor the best Filipino students to study in American universities, with the expectation that upon their return to the Philippines, they would support U.S. policies and institutions. It is of no surprise then that it was considered the highest prestige to study abroad in the United States. The program heavily depended on government funding, which made it a difficult and competitive program to enter. Other than graduating from high school, choice of candidates was influenced by familial status, location, and gender. Initially, the Filipino governor and the American school superintendent from each province chose the candidates. However, in later times, the selection process was done via examinations. Most candidates were predominantly elite males, so although U.S. colonial education trickled down to more rural areas, sponsorship tended to go to candidates from more developed areas.
Towards the latter end of the program's heyday, families began sending their children to study abroad despite the lack of government aid. In large families, priority was given to the eldest male. These individuals were responsible for financially sustaining themselves while abroad. Although the program began to phase out as the students returned to the Philippines, overall, the program enticed and encouraged immigration to the U.S. for the migrant working class. In 1924, the U.S. passed an immigration act that essentially excluded immigration from all of Asia. But because the Philippines was a U.S. colony, Filipinos were deemed U.S. nationals and were allowed to bypass the law. In the decade between the 20s and 30s, a large wave of hopeful students and laborers immigrated to the U.S., determined to achieve the American dream, and driven by the renowned prestige of the United States as constructed by the pensionado elite.
For this new group of Filipino students, traveling to the U.S. was still considered the highest point in their lives. Filipino students worked part-time to fund the costs of their education while simultaneously sending money to their families back in the Philippines. Unfortunately, some had to drop out of school. These Filipinos comprised a group of scholars who were unable to continue their education. Instead, they became part of the blue-collar population working in city restaurants and boarding houses and even as migrant laborers. Filipino immigrants from the rural provinces comprised the majority of migrant laborers that toiled in the fields of the Central Valley and in the canneries of Alaska and Seattle. They were paid as little as $1 a day for 12 hours of work. They were a large working-class population made of predominantly male immigrants, although a small percentage of the immigrant population were women.
At the same time, large communities called Little Manilas began to form in California. Among some of the most populated destinations for Filipinos included Salinas, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Stockton. Although Filipinos did not suffer from restrictive immigration laws, they still endured racism, violence, and discrimination. Recognized as aliens ineligible for citizenship, California passed laws that prohibited Filipinos from owning land and intermarrying with the white population.
Nevertheless, Filipinos proved to be agents of their own fate, as a small courageous few managed to stow away and journey to the U.S. without the protection and consent of the Philippine and U.S. governments. In 1934, the Tidings-McDuffie Act declared Philippine independence and ended Filipino immigration to the U.S. The remaining population established communities and families for over the next 3 decades until another wave of Filipino immigrants entered in 1965.
The pensionado story symbolizes the initial recruitment and retention of Filipino students into higher education. Most of all, they represent a catalyzing force that created the foundations of Filipino America. Knowing their history allows us all to understand ourselves. Embodying their struggles allows us all to critically think about our own privilege. As we progress in our lives today, we all must remember these timeless words. No history, no self. No history, no self.